One of the main uses of R and RStudio is to analyze your own data, and to be able to do that, you need to read in your data. So today's short video is going to be describing how do we read in our data into R and RStudio. So as our overall objective, we have a lab worksheet.qmd, so Quarto Markdown document. And what we want to do is we want to read in this data randomflightdata.csv. Now, if you don't know what .csv stands for, it stands for comma separated values, and it's just the way that our data is stored in the file. Now, this here is an excerpt from the lab worksheet, and we can see down below we have some code to read in the data. Now, this part circled in red is called the path, and we'll be describing what this means very shortly. So first, let's consider how our files would be set up on a hypothetical computer. So we have here a folder called Data Science. Inside this Data Science folder, we have a worksheet called Lab Worksheet. Now within this entire Data Science folder, we have a subfolder called Data, and this folder stores randomflightdata.csv. Now as a bit of a terminology, if we were to double click this QMD file, and it would open in R, the Data Science folder would be what we call the working directory. Now, if this is the working directory, this part that we circle here, this is called the relative path. Now, what do we mean by a path? Well, it's a path because it directs R to where we can find our data. And why do we call it relative? Well, we call it the relative path because the path is relative to the working directory. So it's relative to the data science folder here. So what does this red circle say? It says, from the working directory, go into the data folder, and there you will find randomflightdata.csv. And so if we were to run this, it would work. Now let's have a look at some common issues. Some students will not put this randomflightdata.csv into a data folder and instead set it up like this. So notice randomflightdata is inside the working directory. If we were to run this code, R would complain that it can't find randomflightdata.csv. Now this makes a lot of sense. As this path is written, R is being told, look in the data folder, but here the data folder doesn't exist. In fact, if we were to remove this data slash part, this would work. So the slash means look into the folder called data. So if we were to run this, this would work for this scenario because we're no longer telling it to look in the data folder. We're telling it within the working directory, you'll be able to find this file directly. Another common issue that students will run into is they will have their data science folder and a lab worksheet inside of it, but their data file will be in some other folder. So for example, maybe it's in the downloads folder. When you run this code, R is going to fail. And why is it failing? Well, once again, there is no data folder here, or even if there was a data folder here, the random flights data is not there. And so this path is not a correct path on how to find this data relative to the working directory. Now that we've explained a bit more about how these paths work, let's have a look at how this works in R. So in our live demonstration, I've got here just a Canvas page for some arbitrary course, and I've got a lab worksheet, so we will download that first. And then we also want to download the random flights data. Okay, so I'm just going to go over to this screen here, and you can see I have here my lab worksheet and my random flights data. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to make a folder. Let's just call this data science. You can call it whatever you want. And then within this folder, I'm going to grab the lab worksheet. I'm also going to make a new folder called data. Inside this folder called data, I'm going to input in the CSV file. Okay. So it's like this. We've got our overall folder with our lab worksheet, our data folder with our data inside. Now, one thing I want you to note, I haven't opened this file yet, and I haven't opened it at all. A lot of the time, a student will download it, and then it'll go to their downloads folder, and they'll open it straight away from the downloads folder. That is a bad idea. You should only open the file once you've put it in the location that you want to keep it. If you were to open it whilst it's in the downloads folder, and then you were to move it, R gets confused about where you've been working. In those circumstances, I recommend just saving your document and then closing RStudio completely. And then to reopen it, just find wherever you've stored it, like here, and double click the file, and it will open it in RStudio. Okay, so we've got our RStudio document here. I'm going to go to the source view. I personally prefer that. Okay, so let's just see if this code works. If I run it, we can see it works. We were successfully able to read in data. Why? Because I set it up exactly like I showed you here. Now let's do something wrong. Let's, for example, let's just actually move this data folder outside of this data science folder. If I was to run this now, we get an error, and it says, cannot open file, no such file or directory. Why did this happen? Well, again, the relative path is saying, from this working directory data science, let's go into the data folder, and we should find the file there. But within this working directory, do we have a data file folder? No, we don't. The data folder exists outside, and this is why we get an issue. So if I drag it back in, and now we run this, it works. Let's have a look at another common issue. Let's drag out the random flights data. If I was to run this code now, once again, we get cannot open the connection. Why does this occur? Well, again, our relative path is saying go into the data folder, and there you will find random flights data. Is there a data folder here? No, there's not. And so once again, this gets confused. But actually, if I was just to delete this first part here, random flights underscore data, and we were to run this, now it works because this does make sense. We're saying within the working directory, you'll find random flights data, and we can see within the working directory, the file is indeed there. Okay, so if for some reason you suspect that R is in a different working directory, you can actually in the console write get wd, which stands for get working directory, and it will tell you exactly where it thinks you are. You can also set the working directory to kind of override it. I personally think that's a bit difficult for beginners. So if you ever think R is confused, I would recommend just saving your files and then closing RStudio. Okay, so I'm not going to save the R history. And then just go back to your file and reopen the lab worksheet. And that should reset the working directory to where you want it to be.